Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me here in this amazing panel. It was really exciting this morning to listen to all the regulators speak a little bit in depth about what's happening across Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm a journalist. I work for the Globe and Mail. I write for the Globe's Cannabis Pro product, which is kind of an industry-focused publication, and as well for the newspaper. So getting to kind of hear directly from regulators what they're thinking, what the process is, was really enlightening for me, and I'm sure for everybody else. The panel we have here is really top-notch, and I think we're going to be able to explore a lot of different aspects of what doing business in Latin America for cannabis companies from a Canadian perspective is like, and also opportunities for Latin American companies to come to Canada, access capital markets, find partners, that kind of stuff. So I'll do a quick introduction of everybody, and then Steve over here is going to give us a little kind of presentation to kick things off, and then we'll scoot back into the conversation. So starting over on my far left, we have John Walsh, who's the Director of Drug Policy and the Andes for the Washington Office on Latin America. Next, we have Karina Lanikoski, who's the Vice President of Quality and Regulatory at the consulting firm Cannabis Compliance, Inc., and she oversees CCI's global operations. Next, we have Danny Lipkin, who's the Innovation Sector Head for the Toronto Stock Exchange and the TSX Venture Exchange. Off to my right, we have Eric Foster, who's a partner at the law firm Dentons and who is the head of Dentons' Canadian cannabis practice. And finally, on my far right, we have Steve Orsini, who's the Senior Vice President of International with Canopy Growth Corp, which is Canada's largest cannabis company. And Steve has a long experience as a senior civil servant, and he's going to kick things off telling us a little bit about Canopy Growth, and then we're going to get back to the rest of the panel.
So thank you. I'm thrilled to be here because I spent most of my career as a regulator in various capacities within the Ontario government and the healthcare sector. And I joined Canopy back in March, and it's really seen the worlds come together in a very unique way. So I want to spend a bit of time just highlighting a few things. The other thing I value when I was in my former role, my current role, is when we bring people from around the world together to try to solve problems, we always come up better for it. And I just think today's discussion, the rich conversation we've been having, is just proof of concept that when you bring regulators together with industry, with knowledge, key knowledge leaders, you can really make an impact. So thank you for that. Just Canopy One, our mission to be the best from seed to sale, and we heard that today, that you have to be able to know your product right from the ground up to who it's being administered to, quality, clinical research, and this philosophy, it embeds the entire organization from senior to frontline staff. I won't spend too much time. As you can see, standards and regulations on there. We want to work with regulators. We believe high standards are important. It's important for public trust. It's important for what we do, the clinical research that we do. This is a very busy chart. I just want to make a couple of comments on it. And we heard from the panels earlier, you want to get it right. You want the public interest to be served. You want some standardization so you don't balkanize the regulatory environment. And you have to understand how each regulatory element impacts the benefits to patients and the operations within your jurisdiction. So we're very keen on ensuring that there's a right regulatory environment, that we have high quality, where GMP, GAP for cultivation, GMP for production. These are important cornerstones to Canopy. Again, a very busy slide. I'm just going to make 2 points from this. We're very big on the seeds part of the business as well as the manufacturing and distribution. In Canada alone, we have more than 5 million square feet of licensed cultivation. I know it's not in metric, but in other parts of the world, including Latin America, we have more than 35 million in total. So we are committing to growing and supporting jobs in local communities right around the world. That's a big part of our business, in addition to manufacturing, in addition to clinical research. We work with healthcare professionals. We have a certified medical education program because there's so much information out there. We're working with the Pharmacy Association and the Long-Term Care Association. We have a very simplified way of communicating because patients get so much information. Physicians get so much information. How can we communicate in very clear and concise ways what people are potentially getting? And this spectrum, as you see, the spectrum diagram is a very simple way for people to really understand the amount of THC they're getting versus CBD and vice versa. So you heard from Dr. Mark Ware, and he's leading our clinical research. And people like him in the organization, they're really focused on the clinical research. And we have a number underway. We have 1,000 patients engaged, 60 different clinical trials, one in phase 3. We're looking at animal health, wellness, and the list goes on. And the idea is not just the research we're doing, but the partnerships we're entering into. Protecting our intellectual property is an important goal. It's an important goal for any company. We've registered 90 patents, 230 applications for a whole bunch of things: genetics, therapeutics, technologies. All of these are part of ensuring, as any regulator would want, a company committed to excellence operating in their jurisdiction. This landscape's constantly changing. As you can see, more and more of the world is finding its way to legalize medical cannabis. Some of it was court imposed. A lot of it is regulators becoming more proactive and leading the charge. To understand it, here's our global footprint. I'll just skip over this. We have operations in 5 continents. Let's talk a little about canopy in Latin America and the Caribbean, a very important region in our whole operations. We want to demonstrate excellence in the leadership, working with the communities. As you can see, our partnerships from hospitals and universities, these are building an ecosystem, not only for the research that we're doing, but creating the scientific knowledge in those regions, in those countries. It's not just about selling a product. It's not just about growing the product. It's about building that ecosystem that supports the community, the research, and those that need to regulate it. And as I mentioned, we have 126 hectares fully licensed farm in Colombia. So we have a potential to cultivate considerably with an obligation to work with local farmers. It's not as if we are just growing it. We have an obligation to work with local farming communities as well. Now I get to talk about the best part, our Latin America team. Now I've met a lot of great leaders in my career, but I have to say, Antonio Dogredi, where is Antonio?
They're just actually in the hall.
Oh, they're in the hall. Okay, well, tell Antonio I just gave him a big shout out. Him, Ricardo, and the team, they're so committed to their local community. They're from Latam. They've grown up in Latam. They've worked, their entire careers have been in Latin America. And I think that commitment to the local communities is what makes Canopy not only a global company, but a company close and affiliated to the regions they work in. So the rest of the LATAM team, I'm just going to end off with a couple of food for thought for regulators. And this is something that I often thought about. You know, how can we be proactive? Many jurisdictions, the courts have really triggered a lot. There's We heard today, the courts have set a date. In South Africa, the courts have given the South African government a certain time frame. So what can regulators do to be proactive in a world that's changing? And that's going to be a question that all of you will continually have to deal with. How do we ensure that we act in the public interest and all the rules that are put in are there actually for the public interest, not to control, not to balkanize, but really has a truly benefit for public interest? How do we ensure standardization and harmonization? And we heard that earlier today. Those differences, and this is one thing when I was in the Ontario government, is to look, why are we having that small difference? What's the value of that difference? Is it to give us just our own unique control? That's something that when I was a regulator, we had to be very careful of having those small differences that could really balkanize how business and how patients would benefit from the system, and how companies can be a partner. You want companies to come in, yes, they're going to be selling a product, yes, they're going to be growing, but how can they be true partners? How can they support the local communities? How can we ensure there's social equity? We're going to be replacing maybe high-end opioid drugs with lower cost, effective medical cannabis. All those things that you care about as regulators, companies like cannabis care about as well. So with that, I'm going to stop there and then turn over to Mark to continue with the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was a really great introduction. So I'm gonna start on my right here with Eric. Eric, you're a lawyer. You do a lot of international work with a lot of international clients. If you can kind of set the scene for us in terms of what Canadian clients that are looking to invest in Latin America, what kind of deals they're looking at and relationships they're looking at, and then maybe talk a little bit about some of your Latin American clients and what they're looking for when they come to seek your advice in Canada.
Sure, yeah. So I think we've seen, clearly, and we've heard about this throughout the day, laws are only going in one direction, right? It's constantly liberalizing throughout the world, and particularly, obviously, with Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think you touched on two very distinct points there, Mark. So the first one, obviously, is how can Canadian companies look to access that region, right? And we're seeing increased interest, and we've seen that now for a number of years. The landscape in Canada is such that there are a very significant number of licensed producers in Canada, many of which who have a lot of capital, and I think have started to realize this industry is globalizing, and it's globalizing extremely rapidly. And if your business is just focused on being a cultivator in Canada, that may be a nice business, but are you really capturing the entire opportunity that really might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? So increasingly, we are the world's largest law firm. We're everywhere, actually. Today, we just announced a combination in Uruguay and Argentina, so we've even increased our presence in this region. Clients are approaching us all the time about looking for interesting commercial opportunities in the LATAM region, whether it's a direct acquisition or a potential joint venture, or even just something as simple as a royalty licensing sort of agreement. So there's a lot of interest, kind of southbound interest, right, from Canadian interest going down to Latin America. The opposite is also true, whereas Canada, and in particular Toronto, has really become, I think, kind of the cannabis capital of the world, particularly in terms of trying to raise capital and access to capital. So again, and there's already a good number of Latin American cannabis companies who are listed on the TSX, and I'm sure that's something that Danny can talk quite a bit about. So there's that opportunity. There's also that northbound opportunity here for Latin American or Caribbean companies looking to expand on their business, maybe gain access to the North American market, and most importantly, access capital that they need to continue to grow their business. So both opportunities exist, and they keep us all very, very busy.
And can you give us a sense of, have these opportunities picked up pace in the last little while? Are you seeing an expansion in recent years, in recent months? Tell us a little bit about kind of the pace of change?
Yeah, for sure. No, the industry moves in dog years. I think everybody in the room will appreciate that. But there is absolutely an increased focus, I think, on international opportunities. We've certainly seen that over the last 12 months. Again, it goes without saying the level of creativity too. It keeps us on. It keeps lawyers and all sorts of, I'm sure Karina too, on our toes constantly, because we have. It was funny. There was a Latin American-based client a couple months ago who approached me and said, we just met with this other company. We think there's a terrific commercial opportunity here. Here's what it is. And they handed me a couple of bar napkins with diagrams on it. And they said, go figure this out and go make it legal. So we're seeing all sorts of really creative, interesting commercial transactions. And it has picked up because, again, I think in Canada alone, at least, the shine is a little bit off the solely Canadian plays. Increasingly, people are focused on the globalization of cannabis. And I think that's the future. It's a global industry now.
Yeah, lots to touch on there, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Over to you, Danny. I mean, as Eric mentioned, Toronto's become a hotspot for financing cannabis companies. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of Latin American companies coming up and listing on the venture exchange or the big board. I'm not sure if anybody's on the TSX yet, but I know a number on the venture exchange. So tell us a little bit about kind of how you guys at the TMX Group have, I guess, gone for that opportunity and what kind of opportunity you're seeing there.
Yeah, I think Eric hit it right with we're counting in dog years here. It's crazy to think it's only been about 5.5 years since we listed our first cannabis company on our exchange, which seems like decades ago at this point, and to think what the pace of activity has been over that 5 years. It's interesting that we run, the TSX Venture Exchange and the TSX. A lot of people, on a global basis aren't as familiar with the TSX Venture Exchange, which is an exchange for smaller emerging growth companies. And that's where the majority of our cannabis companies have started over the last number of years, have graduated up to the TSX, to even have Canopy included in the TSX 60. Now we're actually seeing that on a global basis, that cannabis companies all around the world, and very specifically in LATAM, are understanding that, this is the hub for cannabis capital in the world. We actually recently added a presence in South America. Obviously, we would think there'd be a very deep connection between mining and the Canadian economy, but a lot of his time has actually been focused on cannabis because of the opportunities there. We have about 13 companies or so with connections into the LATAM market. We've seen 3 in the last 9 months list, which had kind of pure, what I call Colombian operations list on both TSX Venture and actually the TSX. So that was even as recent as July that we had a Colombian company list on the TSX. So they're seeing that there is great opportunity, and the investor base is very knowledgeable about cannabis operations and want to, as Eric also mentioned, not just invest in Canadian companies, but those global companies. So the LATAM opportunity has been one of our most significant areas of growth. The TSX Venture has this unique program. It's called a capital pool company. I don't want to get into the very specific details of it, where we have investors who are looking to take private businesses public on our exchange. Over the last 6 to 7 months, we've actually had about 6 or 7 LATAM opportunities publicly announced where they're intending to bring these LATAM companies public. Now, the registration office might end up being in Canada, but essentially these are Latin American opportunities, again, utilizing our exchange as an area to grow the business overall. So I think we're really, it's 5.5 years into us as an exchange operating the cannabis business. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface on the LATAM opportunity overall of utilizing the capital markets to help grow and fund those businesses.
Are you seeing most of the companies coming up and listing primarily being Colombian, or are you seeing other companies from other countries also come up and access Canadian capital markets?
Well, Uruguay was actually, ICC was one of the first companies that listed in LATAM. That was obviously a very easy market for us to understand from a regulatory perspective. And that's something that, we're becoming these experts in. We do due diligence from a legal perspective on all jurisdictions where our companies are operating in, not just in cannabis, but this applies to any sector. So we've quickly come up to speed on the different regulatory natures in each country. Uruguay was the easiest one for us to understand right away because that was the first country in the world where it was legal on a full basis. So we had a company that was eventually acquired, listed on a marketplace about a number of years ago. We're now seeing different opportunities through, whether it's Uruguay, Colombia. I think longer term, we're going to see opportunities out of Brazil, Chile. Those marketplaces are also evolving. I think everybody kind of understands right now the Colombia angle very well of the opportunity there, understands the regulatory nature. I think we're seeing the expansion of those other countries and understanding the regulatory framework. Events like this are actually great for expanding that investor pool of knowledge of what is going on in those other markets. It's always easier to fly down and see what's going on. Sometimes it's easier for regulators to come up here and tell us what's really going on from that perspective. So events like this open the pools of capital and the investor base of understanding that. And I think that's why we're going to see over the coming years those other countries be areas of opportunity for growth on our market.
That's great. Passing over to John, a lot of Canadian companies have expressed interest in Latin America and the Caribbean, and there have been joint ventures and there have been direct investments, but doing business in these countries is happening within a specific social context. As in Canada, the legalization of medical cannabis and in some cases recreational cannabis, it's done for development reasons, it's done for social justice reasons, it's done for economic development reasons. And I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of context perhaps for the Canadian firms that are thinking about entering. I don't know if you want to pick a specific country as a case study or perhaps focus on a couple, but a little bit about kind of what's the social context and what are these governments trying to accomplish, to give some context about how Canadians should be thinking about those investment opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think those are really great questions, and I think they pose they're challenging questions for government and regulators and lawmakers as they frame these new regimes to think through. They're not just for industry, they're not just for government to worry about, and in fact, they're for all stakeholders, and in particular, to realize that, and I'll focus on growers a little bit, I think that came up a lot, was sort of forefronted in Jamaica and St. Vincent, and as well in Colombia in terms of how their regime is going to be structured, to think of it as everybody having a role, and especially thinking about the growers themselves, traditional growers who have been supplying illicit markets now in a global regime that's sort of skewed towards, wrongly towards prohibition and criminalization. Are they going to be left out of the newly licit economies that are being created? And to think of it, for a company from the global north, and in the case of Canada, with the advantage of having revised and reformed its legislation earlier than most, what are the goals of those governments in terms of using this new licit sector as an engine for legal growth, not just macro job growth, but also specifically communities in those countries that have been vulnerable and that have been proactively at the wrong end of repression. In other words, under the drug war, they've been repressed extremely proactively because there's a treaty system, but also because governments have taken it on, and the U.S. has pressured, et cetera. There's a long history there, and I think for companies and governments that look to operate and help their companies operate in Latin America is to recognize that socially that's a huge issue in Latin America, and governments need to be serious about how they go about it, to include traditional growers in the new economies, and to ensure that it's not a case of merely passive lip service, but as proactively as the repression has taken place, proactive strategies for inclusion also need to take place so that those communities really are partnering, they really are being taken seriously, and to not see it as simply a challenge. And I think all the challenges are in the forefront, and they came up this morning as well, but to realize why it's an opportunity for governments, but also for industry to, on the one hand, recognize this newly licit market as an engine for economic growth and inclusion, especially for marginalized communities, and that is, socially speaking, one of the most important things on these governments' agenda, and also to recognize from the industry's point of view the benefits of ethical sourcing. And I think, it didn't come up so much today explicitly yet, but the idea of the particular place, the particular culture, the traditions that cannabis has flourished in and has represented for these countries and and places within these countries. And in terms of different products, we think of terroir or something that connotes a history and a tradition and a culture. And I think go back to what was said at the earlier panels, you know, the Rastafarians had it right, all right? If they had it right, they also have something to lend, and I use that for a shorthand of traditional growers. They have knowledge, and they have something, you know, that the industry, not in a purely sort of instrumental way, could really benefit from. So I think that's, you know, where you're talking about Jamaica, St. Vincent, Colombia, Mexico, especially countries with long histories of traditional or illicit growth to supply the illicit market, would be a dramatic development if prohibition over decades couldn't sort of destroy those traditional cultures of cultivation, and if illicit economies grow up and all of a sudden those people are excluded.
I was just going to say, you know, one thing that we constantly point to for this economic engine of growth is showing what's happened in Canada from these communities that, you know, had industry change over the last number of years. And cannabis has been the number one source of growth in a lot of small communities from coast to coast. Like, the facilities become the largest employers in the town. There's a revitalization and like a positivity when we go to these communities that people say there's opportunity here again. You know, it's always, you know, a 3,000 to 10,000 person community where there's not a lot of job opportunity necessarily. And then, you know, a facility gets built, they're the number one job growers. And, you know, I visit these facilities and people say, you know, at job fairs, there'll be like 1,000 applicants. Like, you know, it's like the entire town will basically want to apply because this is such a great opportunity to get into an industry that's so early stages. And that's why I think the LATAM opportunity from that perspective is so great, from improving communities, you know, within those areas that may have, you know, been impoverished or had some challenges from changes in industries over the last number of years.
John, I just wanted to follow up on what you said. From a Canadian company perspective, if I'm going into these markets, how do I go about connecting with these communities? How do I go about understanding that this, you know, economic development of this part of this country or what have you is a priority for the government? And how do I go about, I guess, designing my strategy to take all those things into account?
I think you really, obviously, due diligence in understanding the country, the culture, what was behind the law, and the key drivers for that government. What do they really need to get out of it? What are those goals? And where are the areas that the government themselves, the lawmakers, and also civil society, not just industry, but civil society, has long pointed to needs for development and could see this as an engine and could help you learn what's needed. But when I mentioned before, not being just passive, but sort of being proactively looking for ways to include, realizing that it's not just a challenge, but it's beneficial. Think about not just, well, we're open to you, but preferential access for people who actually have a history of growing. They know the region. So I think the devil will be in the details, the particular community, the people who know it best. But I think it really behooves any company, just at the very least, to avoid bad surprises, but to really do their due diligence to know the community they're working with, know what makes it tick, and know how there could be for that company, from a purely sort of enlightened self-interest approach, what would be the real value add of being able to work with them and bring to the foreground some of the real attributes that community has. And most of all, I think, come to it with the proper humility. The company brings a lot. The industry will bring a lot in terms of capital, in terms of knowledge, in terms of contact, but there's things that the local community has that the company cannot replicate, and that's where they're going. And I think if the sort of, you know, we don't shy away from the use of the word magic, but there's some sort of alchemy there where working with the community properly and partnering, I think, can bring out the best in both.
Karina, there is obviously, as every country brings their own system online, there's a lot of differences in terms of requirements for operation, changes country to country. I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of when Canadian companies, which have a very specific set of regulations and set of quality controls, are going into Caribbean and Latin American countries and having to adapt to their regulatory systems. Are you seeing that as an easy process? Are you seeing that as a complicated process? Run us through a little bit about how that's going.
Definitely not an easy process. There are, as you mentioned, every jurisdiction is putting in place their regulations, which get pushed down into the manufacturing and operational compliance requirements on the ground floor. And having to deal with multi-jurisdictions when you're used to a certain regime can be a challenge for those companies. So we do see, our business started in Canada. We have hundreds of clients here. We're seeing them now move to Latin America, not just to access those markets, but also as an entry point to the world. So while they're going down south, they have to comply with the country where they're going to set up their shop, but they're also often looking at Europe. So then they have to also implement the European requirements, which are more of a medicinal, the EU GMP requirements on the ground floor, while having the knowledge base from Canadian regulations. So you're actually now looking at a company that needs to be compliant in many jurisdictions. They need to have the knowledge and be able to actually figure out on the ground floor what small differences that may have in their manufacturing. And those small differences are kind of the devil in the details that you mentioned from a regulatory compliance perspective too, because if you don't know the implementation piece, then you're going to fail in one or the other jurisdiction. They're also dealing with multiple regulators auditing those facilities. So hosting a German inspectorate in Colombia, may not be something that the company is used to, and that's a different level of compliance, different way of dealing with the jurisdiction. And then just adding to that, it goes right down to the product level. So the product produced for say Colombia, that's a flower, will be very different than a product that's an oil that's exported into Germany ultimately. So understanding the specifications for that product, whether or not you can use pesticides, just all those little details that go into the product need to be understood by the companies in those countries.
And I want to touch on, probably with everybody, questions of export. And are we talking about investing in Latin American and Caribbean countries for export? But I mean, you mentioned right there differences in quality assurance around products. And I'm wondering, have you seen much success so far in exporting to European markets from Latin American or Caribbean countries, or exporting to Canadian markets? And what's led to those successes?
Not yet, but businesses are setting up to do that. I think generally people have the feeling that it's going global. A lot of businesses are taking the bet that it is going global and that those export rules will open up. So in terms of export from Latin America into Canada to supply, say, a rec market, that's not going to happen anytime soon. It's not not permitted in our regulations. And there's good reasons behind that. Canadians set up a system for manufacturing that is unique here. It's GPP, good production practices. No other jurisdiction recognizes that. And Health Canada certainly isn't going to be doing GPP inspections in other countries. It's a resource issue at this point in time, along with the treaties that restrict that. So, the import-export piece is still a challenge for country to country, but it's coming, and I think businesses are definitely gearing up for it.
Great.
Yeah, I'd echo that sentiment. We're seeing increasing, and actually I think we have our friends from Cleverleaves even here today, and I think they were the first one to actually export from Latin America to Europe, but it's not widespread yet for sure. There's still quite a significant number of regulatory hurdles, and obviously anytime you're dealing with import-export issues, you're dealing with the regulatory scheme of two different countries, right? Both the exporting nation and the importing nation. But again, it's something that, as we've all heard, the trend is just towards liberalization. So although there is not that widespread import-export component of these businesses now, it's coming, and companies are actively looking at those opportunities. And I think they're already starting to build scale, anticipating that. You see companies talking about that, whether obviously very prospective in terms of marketing pitches, or in terms of what they're trying to tell their investors as part of their business strategy, but absolutely everybody's looking at that.
And what's changing? Are things changing from a regulatory standpoint, or are regulators just becoming more comfortable with the idea of import and export?
I think it's a mix. I think the regulatory scheme has to change first, but generally I think this is just a more accepted and socially accepted business, and it's big business, and anytime that governments see an opportunity to potentially tax it and make a little bit of money too, that's going to generally, I think, have a pretty significant impact on the speed at which something like this liberalizes. So it's coming, and I think all governments are focused on it, if only because A, the cannabis industry is here to stay, and I think, again, it's more accepted, and B, it's an opportunity for them to make some money.
Steve, over to you. Maybe you can tell us from the perspective of the largest Canadian LP. You've made investments in Colombia. I believe you have investments in several other Latin American countries, Caribbean country as well, I believe. Tell us a little bit about where these countries fit into the broader canopy strategy. Is this ultimately a regional play? Is it an attempt to set up low-cost production to ship internationally? Give us a bit of the kind of broad picture of how an LP looks at these opportunities.
So we would look at it from a number of perspectives, and I think you hit on some of the key ones. First of all, you look at the region, just the climate alone. You look at it as a cost-effective jurisdiction. It's free trade zone. One of the advantages, they're working together to create their free trade zone that will allow, if you are operating in there, you got high quality products, you're doing your clinical research, and you're investing in the communities, it could be a potential significant contributor to a global supply chain. And I think we're all learning. The regulators are working through their issues, and we're working with them. And I think, from seed to sale, understanding the quality, tracing every step through the system, knowing good agricultural practices, good GMP at the same time, you would then see opportunities that may not exist to this day because the import-export rules are evolving. But the region itself is dynamic, and it's one that the strains, the climate, the people have been growing for years, learning from the local inhabitants the potential to build new products, new science. The clinical research that we're doing, that Dr. Mark Ware mentioned in Chile and other parts, that is like cutting edge research that's going to help not just our operations in LATAM or Caribbean, but globally as well. So we think operating a global entity, but with strong regional presence in key market areas, is going to be beneficial for the entire organization.
Are you building up the system, though, with the idea that eventually you will be able to ship product and export product?
We
more
are
freely?
looking at all different opportunities. And as production gets established, we'll be looking for the most cost-effective way to move products around, subject to the regulatory requirements, and it will come. And some of it, we've been exporting to Europe for quite a while, and so that market is fully established, and we're just looking new ways. We have a new facility in Denmark coming on board. And so it will be GMP certified. It will have ability to supply the European markets. Beyond that, we don't know. But also we're looking at Australia and South Africa. All of them will play regional roles. But at some time in the future, maybe sooner than most people think, we'll be able to look at how do we build a very integrated global supply chain.
Perhaps, I'm personally interested in hearing, and I'm sure maybe some of the Latin American companies in here are, about how a Latin American firm partners with a big LP and what big LPs are looking for when they're looking at international partners. So if you could speak a little bit about not necessarily what Canopy does every time it plunks down its flag in a new country, but in general terms, what kind of advice or thoughts do you have on firms that are looking to Canada, looking to find a JV partner or an investor? Any thoughts?
Well, I have a great example in Colombia. We've entered an agreement with ProCaps, which is a soft gel manufacturer that supplies pharmaceutical companies. And so highly regarded, GMP, as FDA approved in the U.S. So we are really fortunate to see these companies in Latin America that are global in standard and what they've been able to achieve. So we would look for that symbiotic relationship. Do we buy and try to build there, or do we find a partner that we could be faster to market? Is they're meeting global standards, and it was a perfect relationship that will create jobs and growth in that community that's already been established. They have their supply chain networks. All those things exist now, and we're building up that ecosystem. So you look for that symbiotic relationship. So you don't always have to build everything. You can partner. And we find partnering can often give you a faster speed to market than starting from scratch and building something from ground up. So it's a case-by-case basis. But we see with the collaboration among the regulators in Latin America and their willingness to look at harmonizing their standards, high standards to protect the public for sure, making sure that there's clinical research supporting it, there's evidence, there's quality manufacturing. When you're confident with a strong, high standard regulatory regime that we see developing, you wouldn't miss an opportunity to invest in those jurisdictions.
Eric, maybe you could talk a little bit about when Canadian firms are making that investment or preparing to make that investment, how they're going about doing due diligence on potential partners. There's been some high-profile cases of write-downs on assets that were acquired by Canadian LPs, some slightly controversial acquisitions, and I'm wondering if you can talk generally about how you go about doing due diligence for these clients and what kind of things Canadian companies should be thinking about when they're looking at partnering.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Steve pointed out, I think these commercial relationships, they take a whole host of different structures, right? Whether it's a straight acquisition, a joint venture, or just a licensing agreement to try to get brand proliferation out there. But the one thing that is constant for sure is that there are due diligence obligations, especially in connection if you're a large Canadian or any Canadian public company. That's an expectation. The board has to do it, and obviously Danny and the team at the TSX are relying on local counsel to help with that. So absolutely, I think initially these things often start out as fact-finding missions, and Steve can probably attest that when you go down to a region and try to figure out who do you connect with, who do you think you're going to be able to partner with, and some of that just, it's who do you want to do business with. But then you do have to get into the meat and potatoes of it and really do comprehensive due diligence. And you're right, I think the industry has been struck with, I don't know if scandal's the right word, but too many instances of maybe lack of due diligence, some corporate governance issues, and frankly, it's still very much that rising tide lifts all boats, but it has the opposite effect as well. So when something like this happens, and a company, is being questioned for an acquisition or a partnership they made, whether it's in the Caribbean or Latin America, it impacts the entire region. So doing proper due diligence is absolutely essential, and I think it's a combination of frankly, using good third-party advisors. And I'm not here to shill for Denton's, but it's true. You have to make sure you are working with local legal counsel who is excellent, who understands the entire regulatory regime, and can complete a full-out, comprehensive diligence review, ensuring all licenses are in place, reviewing all correspondence with the regulator, any other kind of corporate taxation issues from a legal standpoint. And I think the other thing that's important is also not just working with legal advisors, but also consultants, probably like Karina and her team, frankly, who can also provide really helpful advice and effectively provide a shield to a Canadian company and their board to say, no, we ran a proper process. At the end of the day, I always say, if somebody's going to lie to you, they're going to lie to you, and you can't really stop that. But it all comes down to making sure that you've done a real proper process by using good advisors. And I think, frankly, Donnie, I think that's what the stock exchange is expecting of their listed issuers.
I can add to that a little bit in terms of the due diligence, because we don't do it from a legal perspective, we do it from a compliance perspective. So we usually add to the due diligence package by doing a quality systems audit. which includes getting in at the ground floor and seeing how that firm is operating on a day-to-day basis. Who is making the quality decisions? Are people involved, or are the quality units involved in the quality decisions? And very importantly, for the joint ventures and the mergers and acquisitions, do you have quality agreements in with your supply chain? We see a lot of deals going on between boardrooms, but they're not actually established between quality units. So this is things like, do you need to be notified in case of a recall? How long do they need to notify you in? What kind of product specifications are they putting in for your product? Labeling requirements, all those, again, the little details that need to be established between companies, and those should be established in formal agreements. And they often aren't. It's such a new industry that it hasn't become standard practice like it has in pharmaceuticals.
I was going to expand. It's the idea that there hasn't been this long history and long area of expertise specifically in cannabis, but we've seen more and more of the pharma industry moving into the space, and experts in that domain being the consultative experts of, going down and doing the due diligence, helping people build out, and from a compliance perspective, we're really seeing that evolve very, very quickly. Again, it's only been 5 years, so that takes time. But as Canada's kind of leading that charge from an intellectual property knowledge standpoint, we're seeing a lot of export of our knowledge base to those other areas, and we're seeing a lot of companies like yourself who can, help companies in LATAM specifically set up, good operations, good compliance, and then when there's acquisitions, joint ventures done with those other companies, there's an understanding from maybe a Canadian LP or a European LP that, good practice has been put in place because they've been using the best practices that we've learned in Canada over the last number of years.
And I would also actually just add to the delivery of actual legal opinions is increasingly common for transactions of this nature. So if a Canadian company is making an investment in a Latin American company, oftentimes when we're advising them, we would expect to be delivered a formal legal opinion from a reputable law firm in South America, confirming, and all these legal opinions have all sorts of qualifications, but effectively confirming that the company is acting in full compliance with law. And on the same note, we get asked to give those legal opinions all the time too. And I think originally law firms had some challenges doing this, but I think again, increasingly law firms, we as a firm certainly can get comfortable with that. And I think most firms should be able to get comfortable to be able to provide a proper legal opinion to say, no, this company is complying with the law and they have valid licenses that haven't expired and everything is copacetic.
John, if I can fire over to you, it's been mentioned a couple of times, kind of the international treaty framework in which, all commerce will ultimately unfold over the coming years. There seems to be movement afoot, whether it's the World Health Organization recommending that CBD be descheduled and cannabis THC be rescheduled. I understand there's a number of processes that you need to go through, and if you can just give us an overview of kind of where the discussions stand right now in terms of potential amendments or changes to the UN conventions on that relate to cannabis.
Yeah. So that obviously a huge variable, actually multi-variable. But as was mentioned earlier, the treaties as they stand are grudgingly tolerant, I would say, of medical and scientific cannabis. That's even maybe too light a way of saying it. I mean, they really stigmatize it, but they do permit it. They make it difficult. And I think one of the most important things that the WHO recommendations include is that they would remove cannabis from Schedule 4 of the single convention, which is the one that basically stigmatizes. It says it doesn't have any therapeutic value. Obviously that can't be sustained by modern science. I mean, so the WHO has recommended now that the membership countries of the CND, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, need to vote on that recommendation. It's one of the few things that happens at that level by majority vote, or depending on the treaty, a 2/3 requirement. So this is going to come to a vote sooner or later, perhaps as early as next March. And that will have significant implications for the environment and the market, because up until now, as I say, discouraging, stigmatizing, and grudgingly tolerating on the basis of basically no science. So for a WHO recommendation to say it shouldn't be in Schedule 4 to begin with, that's going to give other countries who may have been reluctant to move forward with at least a medical market a green light that this is a WHO recommendation and it's been endorsed by CND. So that's going to be a big moment. If the CND polarizes and can't even vote that recommendation for approval, that will also be a big moment. So that's something to watch. The bigger, two other variables there are other countries beyond Canada and Uruguay, and we've already talked about Mexico earlier, moving in the direction of adult use legalization beyond just medical. All right, that's something that the treaties explicitly disallow. There's not just a grudging tolerance for it. There's a severe and explicit disallowal. So what that means in terms of this growing group of countries, like-minded countries that are going to medical but then going beyond, is that those like-minded countries need to make some common cause in figuring out their strategies of how to relate to the treaties that explicitly forbid what they're doing. Canada and Uruguay are in this boat already. Canada has said, we recognize that what we're doing is out of compliance with the treaties, and we're going to work with our partners in the international community to resolve this question. There are a number of procedures that could be used. We, in civil society, NGOs we work with, and in consultation with a lot of governments in this area, and I'll mention governments that are heading in this direction. We know Mexico, Luxembourg is talking about regulating. New Zealand is going to have a ballot initiative. Netherlands is doing its own sort of structured supply of the coffee shop. So there is a lot of movement. I think Canada is really significant in showing it can be done, and it can be done by a country that's seen as, very safe and sound. So those countries, to think of this as something that they can do together. There's a procedure known as the inter-se procedure where like-minded countries can come together, think through the challenge, and come up with sort of, if you would, a little mini treaty platform for countries that are going to respect their obligations to countries that are staying in the traditional single convention system, but among themselves have a new system for countries that have decided to regulate adult use cannabis. And that lends itself to all sorts of innovations in terms of, including exports, but also standardizing the rules among a set of countries that is clear about health, safety, but also social justice. So I think this is where it's headed. Countries can try to one-off it and try to address the treaty issues that way, but I think they're going to be much stronger coming from a position of strength in numbers as they address these treaty questions.
How are we doing for time? A couple more minutes. I want to open it up to the floor. Yep, over here.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on Mr. Walsh's comments exactly about the international treaties, because there are some countries that are taking the position as Canada and Uruguay. There are other countries that, because of their reading of the treaties, or their position, they just want to be strictly by the letter and follow the rules, and that poses different conditions in different countries. And for example, I'm also very interested in understanding what are the real consequences, which I assume for the moment there are none, because Canada and Uruguay are still in the UN, has not been kicked off. And the real consequences, for example, on those annual provisions informations, that there are some countries, and in my case I talk about Peru, the position is that Peruvian regulators feel that the provisions are strict quotas that they need to fulfill or respect, while a lot of people that I've spoken with take those as guidelines more than quotas. And a concrete example, what happened with Colombia, that recently, I think the regulator said that their quotas were diminished by tenfold, just because the UN said it was like that. So if you can please give information on how is there any consequences, or what's the real power of those treaties about the freedom of a country to say we're going to produce this amount of medicinal legal cannabis?
Yeah. The treaties are supposed to be, the obligation is one that a country freely takes on to implement. So it assumes no major enforcement mechanism, but rather the will of the country to do so. I think where we find ourselves with cannabis is that countries are deciding that the treaty obligation to expressly and completely prohibit is unworkable. It doesn't work. It undermines health and safety and individual rights. So they're moving away from it. The question is, what can the treaty system do about that? You know, most of the power has been, it's been a political question rather than a concrete enforcement mechanism question. There is, within the single convention, something called Article 14, where the International Narcotics Control Board, which is sort of the quasi-judicial watchdog of the treaties, of some aspects of the treaties, can counsel a country that they're going out of compliance in a way that jeopardizes the entire treaty system. This is really strong medicine. It's going really far. And the question is, to what effect anyway, if a country is bound to go in the direction that they're going? What we've seen is, in the case of cannabis, which is really frontal on this issue now, a deepening polarization with some countries, I'd say, led vociferously by Russia, for example, on one side arguing that, and I think from the point of view of, let's make an example of Canada, let's show everyone that if you go this route, you're really going to be condemned internationally, and then you'll stop. That's not going to work, all right? That's not going to work. Countries are going to move ahead. So the question is, in a situation where the INCB, the board that I mentioned before, doesn't seem to be modernizing itself, prepared to cope with these changes, and work with countries to make these adjustments, there's going to be a set of countries who are not going to be able to achieve a new consensus internationally about how to deal with cannabis. That's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. So in a case where there's no reason to expect a new consensus, yet countries like Canada, Uruguay, Mexico, and I can name many others, are not going to step back. They're not going to be pressured back either. There needs to be some sort of escape valve to modernize the treaty system and allow countries who are going to do something that they are convinced, and I agree, is going to do a better job of achieving the aims of the conventions, which are human health and welfare. So if that's going to happen, there needs to be, I think, a critical mass of those like-minded countries who realize the strength in numbers, who make it clear that they're very serious about they won't be pushed back, and that the treaty system itself defines procedures for them to follow. One might be reservations, late reservations that Bolivia used, for instance, in the case of the coca leaf, withdrew, came back to the treaties, explicitly allowing the legal use of coca within Bolivia under the treaties, which is something that they missed before. A country could do that individually, but again, I think it would behoove that country and the others in this growing movement to think collectively and to use the sort of inter se modification mechanism, which has challenges of its own, but I think would be superior in one respect because no one can vote against it. There's no way for other countries to say, well, we disapprove. No mechanism for that. So I think this is coming. It's a matter of time. The treaty system as it is stuck. Can't resolve this in a consensus basis, and therefore like-minded countries are going to have to move on their own, not in a way that's disrespectful, but in a way that is ultimately more respectful of a treaty system that was built for a purpose and it doesn't work.
Yes, thank you. Most large mining companies now take quite seriously the effects of what they do on the small rural communities where they conduct their mining. But it's taken a very long time for them to learn that they need to do this. The idea of including the kinds of concepts of social equity that John was talking about, I think there's an opportunity now, because it's a new event, a new social change, there's an opportunity to make sure that those kinds of concerns are included in due diligence operations whenever companies are expanding or making investments in cannabis around the world. I was quite struck that when you started talking about due diligence, it turned entirely around legal issues and compliance issues for quality, but there was no mention of the social equity. There was also no mention of environmental considerations. I had the opportunity just about a year ago during the dry season in Lesotho to arrive looking primarily at integrated watershed management. Just outside Maseru, the capital city, I saw some of the most beautiful flat land, the greenest that I saw anywhere in the country. Asked what's going on there. Oh, that's a Canadian company doing cannabis investment. Lesotho is a water-producing country for all of Southern Africa. The most critical issue for the country are the two issues. One is how do you manage the water? Two, how do you stop having to import about 80% of the food that is eaten in the country? There are very few places that could have good irrigated agriculture for horticulture. Now, the tax benefits and the employment benefits out of the cannabis, I can understand fully why Lesotho wants to do it. I can understand why Steve wants the company to be operating there. However, it does seem to me to be very important to make sure that when any country, any company is going into any country and looking at it, that part of what they look at is what are the social impacts and what are the environmental impacts of this, and that should be built in from the ground level and not make the mistakes that the Canadian industry got a bad name for itself in mining by not doing that at first, and it's taken a long time to play catch up.
Thank you. That's a really important comment. I wonder if anybody wants to comment on that. Yeah, thank you for that.
I'm part of an initiative called the Global Cannabis Partnership, which is implementing corporate social responsibility in the cannabis space early on, before the disasters happen as occurred in the mining industry. So I think a lot of the controls are still at the municipal level, and there are initiatives to bring that to a broader base. There's a good number of companies that have joined the GCP to stand up and say, we believe that corporate social responsibility, including environmental initiatives, are important, and we will sign up and do our own continuous improvement before it's mandated. So there are initiatives out there. It's just, again, very early. It is still very early, and we're relying a lot on the municipal level to control things like that.
I would just say that it is a very important topic. It's one that can't be considered seriously. Every community we work with the ecosystem that's been established, whether the local farmers or it's supplying, purchasing from the local community to get that bigger multiplier effect. You talk to anyone in Smith Falls, you talk to people, and we're operating in Latin America and elsewhere. But these issues, happy to engage as a company of how we can make sure that we continue to look in those directions, because we agree from a philosophical, economical, and social, environmental perspective. I think we're all in agreement. In fact, we have someone in the company, Hillary Black, that her job is to look at corporate social environmental responsibility.
Looks like that was the last comment. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate that comment and also the question over there. Thank you to everybody on the panel. It was really, really, I think, enlightening for me and hopefully for some other people, and we'll pass it back over there.
Great, thank you. And yes, please. Thank you all. As I think most of you are aware, my name is Marta Blackwell, and I'm Vice President of the CCA, and it's my honor here to do the very quick closing remarks. I do just, before we leave, I do want to thank you all for being here. We know that it's been a long morning and appreciate your patience. And actually, very big thank you to all of our panelists here right now, as well as earlier throughout the morning. Some of them who've come from far and wide, so very much appreciate that. We wouldn't have been able to pull this off with some of our extreme partnerships, particularly with Canopy Growth. I also see Ambassador Vidal from Uruguay, who started the conversations with us about almost a year ago, I would say. So very much appreciate everyone's participation and willingness to be here. And as I think Ken did mention this morning, this is intended to be the first of an annual. So we very much look forward to having you all with us next year, and hopefully with even some more regulators from across the region as this issue continues to, or as this sector continues to grow and progress throughout the region. And from our perspective, we would really, really like to keep Canada at the forefront of those continuing discussions about the progression of the sector. So thank you all very, very much. And with that, I bid you all farewell, and thanks so much for being here. Take care.